Today and Thursday, I'm going to give a pair of lectures which really go together. They are mutually complementary. So these two talks together are about sort of the relationship between, or I should say among, memory, attention, and perception. And hopefully, we tend to study these in sort of compartmentalized, siloed ways, and I hope that through these two lectures you'll join me and start thinking about these as interrelated, functionally cooperating processes. So to make a start, we tend to think about memory as being about the past. So if we go back to some of the oldest definitions or explanations about empirical study of memories to Ebbinghaus, we hear him talk about memories as mental states of every kind which were at one time present in consciousness and then have disappeared. In contrast, we tend to think about attention as being about the future. And again, if we go to some of the founders of the study, the scientific study of attention, William James, he talks about this organic adjustment or ideational preparation, or what he calls pre-perception, as this attentive orienting state to pick up the world. But what I want to sort of convince you over the next couple of lectures is that maybe these are slightly too categorical and too independent ways of thinking about this line of time in our cognition, and actually both memory and attention play roles in the past and in the future, and they rarely live sort of in the present. So I would like to sort of, the whole point is to convince you that memory and attention work together, linking past and future to guide our adaptive behavior. So in this schema that I'm going to propose, we have memory across many different time scales, and here I've put them separated as iconic, working memory, and long-term memory. These, obviously, there are some functional distinctions as we go through these different types, but you can also think of them as a more continuous stretch of time with some overlap. But these traces left behind are the traces that provide informational content to guide our perception. And attention, in my way of thinking, are the set of functions that prioritize and select information based on these memory traces in order to guide perception. And almost all of the field or cognitive neuroscience focuses on what I would call this anticipatory arrow of attention, where we take, and the most prevalently studied is that this idea that we hold our goals represented in working memory, and that those influence through top-down connections our pickup of the world to guide perception. But this can also happen with long-term memories guiding perception, and also very short-term traces guiding perception as well. But there is also another type of arrow of attention, which I'll also introduce you to, which I would call retrospective attention, where as our goals and our knowledge changes, we're also able to prioritize and select information within these various traces that exist within our memories. And of course, we do this then also to continue to guide perception. So there's this mutual set of functions which are selecting and prioritizing information within our memories, and then from our memories then to guide perception. So the lecture today is going to be really focusing on how we remember with the benefit of foresight. So a lot about this retrospective acting upon. As we know things, as we know what we anticipate, we can act upon these memory traces in order to guide perception. But I also want to say a little bit about how the nature of our memories themselves are very forward-looking. They're also there to guide perception, and not there just as a reminiscing or for the past. So over the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to convince you that memories are not just snapshots of what happened, veridical, representational traces about the past, but instead functional traces or functional states that serve the future. And the talk is really about how these memories are selective, informative, action-ready, prospective, flexible, and dynamic. So before I start, I'd just like to give some definitions so that some of these terms, especially in human neuroscience and in psychology, can be very broad, and people have different meanings that they associate with them. So I'll just tell you where I'm working from. So I'm going to be primarily talking about working memory and attention. So by working memory, I simply mean the storage and manipulation of recently acquired information, which is independent of any need for continuous sensory stimulation to guide behavior over the short term. So you can think of it as almost equivalent in some cases also to short-term memory, depending on what your definition of short-term memory is. Of course, working memory is essential for cognition. It tends to be studied within these very constrained types of experimental tasks, which are called delayed response tasks. So like delayed match to sample tasks or delayed non-match to sample tasks, change detection tasks, partial report, full report. But they're also relevant in many, many other types of contexts. So for example, if things become occluded and we need to maintain information in mind, in mental rotation, as we explore the environment and keeping track of some things as we look for others, and as we do mental computations and calculations, for example, in a game of chess. So of course, we're going to be studying it in this kind of narrow way, but this is, I would say, a really essential building block for our cognition. Attention, as I'm going to be talking about, is really selective attention, is, as I mentioned, really about the prioritization and selection of relevant information to guide adaptive behavior. It is not a state or a thing, it is not consciousness, it is not effort, it is these sets of selection and prioritization of information. I have argued in the past that this is actually a ubiquitous function of all, a ubiquitous property of all kinds of cognitive functions. We have selection and prioritization operating sort of within language, within perception, and we have a standard paradigm, or a typical paradigm, whereby, as I kind of briefly alluded to before, the focus is on how we anticipate some spatial location or some object-based feature of items based on our goals in order to influence perception. But over my work in the lab, and also that of many other labs, we've argued that actually there are many, many different types of attributes. For example, I'll be showing a lot of a way in which our brain can anticipate things also in time. But we can also anticipate meanings of things, of many, many different attributes that we can anticipate, modalities. As most of the field focuses on how short-term goal-based representations influence processing, but as I said, we'll also see, especially on Thursday, how our long-term memories are also influencing processing. And very much the part of the topic for today, that these selection and prioritization, they don't just happen early in perception, they happen across the sensory motor thing, they happen also within motor systems, within decision making, but also not just in the upcoming sensory motor act, but also backwards to select and prioritize information in our memories. Okay, so I'll start off just kind of with a usual starting point, which is the standard view, like the textbook idea of what we have of the neural basis of working memory was, I guess, pioneered by Joachim Fuster, who showed this existence of these delay activity neurons. So these neurons that display activity of about an item when the item is no longer there but will return and be relevant for behavior. And these neurons then fire during the delay period. And this was taken as a trace of this item, as if the continued permanence of this item in the brain. And this is such a prevalent concept that we tend to think of working memory as these kind of enduring, constant traces that live in these spiking of these neurons. This has been replicated numerous times. Pat Goldman-Rakesh did a lot of work on this. We can see it in other labs like Funahashi, and we can also see it with MRI. And we can see it in prefrontal areas, which is where Fuster discovered it, but also in many different sensory areas in the brain as well. And I'm not going to show you this just to save time, but over the last 50 years or so, the field has also shown that these traces are not quite so permanent and veridical and inflexible. So obviously as I said, these working memory traces are essential for attention. So for example, in a lot of the attention literature, people have shown that you get these delay activity patterns from a working memory thing in order to guide perception. So Leo Kelazzi showed this. We showed this with like multivariate pattern analysis for the first time in the human brain. But these traces themselves are selective. So for example, if you get a whole display and you know that only half of it is relevant, you won't maintain the whole thing. You will maintain the relevant thing more than the entire thing. So there's some selection during encoding about what's relevant. And even in some cases, the traces that you maintain can be distorted. So for example, in some cases, if you're having to distinguish a color among other distracting colors, and most of your, let's say you're kind of a purpley thing that you have to detect as a target, if all the distractors, you know them to be more on the blue side, what you're going to do is not represent exactly the purple. You're going to push the representation toward the pink so that you can distinguish it better. So sometimes you get adaptive distortions of these traces in order to guide behavior. So this is some beautiful work, for example, by Joy Zhang and John Sorensis, for example, have shown this at the neural level. So these traces then can be selective, they can be kind of distorted to be adaptive, and I'm going to show you that we've recently shown that these are also highly prospective and sort of future-facing and action-ready. So this is the so I'm going to tell you mainly today about experimental work that's been done in my lab, primarily kind of very recent work. So this is a study done by Frederick van Ede, who's a Marie Curie fellow in the lab. And he took the usual working memory task and added a small but very informative twist to it. So in this task, people get two oriented bars that they see of different colors. They encode that. They're supposed to just encode it, keep this in memory. And then at some point, they're just told which of these two items they have to report. And they have to report it by moving these place markers to match the orientation that item, of that color in memory. So the clever thing that Frake did is he forced people to use one or the other hand in order to make this judgment. So you could only move this thing to the right if with the right hand, and you could only move it counterclockwise with the left hand. So in this case, you'd have to use the right hand to report this item and the left hand to report that item. And these orientations and colors changed moment to moment. And people can do this. We see that people can use the left and right hand, and they report the different tilts as the items are different tilts. They make a very sharp response around the correct orientation, and they're quite fast at doing this. So the black line is the group, and then all the other lines are all the individual participants. And by doing this, we can actually we record EEG from the brain, and we can tell, first we can look at the brain selecting the visual information, and here what we expect to see based on a lot of other work is this lateralization of alpha band activity. So the EEG desynchronizes or gets lower power in the alpha contralateral to the relevant item being selected. Or we can see which hand is being selected by looking at, again, lateralization of the beta band activity. And in doing that, we can compare these different scenarios. So this is the scenario where most people would think would happen, probably, that you get a probe, you say, okay, I have to report this item. So first you activate visual selection, and then once you have enough information, then you activate the motor. You select the motor plan. Or you can think, actually, you don't need to do this at all in this task. The most efficient thing you can do is you could recode those items into motor responses, and then you can throw away the visual information and just be ready to go with the action whenever that happens. Or you could actually possibly have both of these codes running in parallel in the brain. I hope that's clear. Please feel free to interrupt me if something's completely unclear. So this is just to show, and these are completely orthogonal. So so that we can look at visual selection and motor selection completely independently from each other because it's fully orthogonally manipulated in the brain. And this is just showing the alpha pattern of alpha activity. When we select left versus right, you get desynchronization or blue on the right. And here's the beta band activity with a different hand selection. And have a guess at what you think might happen. And what we found was quite surprising, actually. We found that actually the alpha and the beta band activity related to visual and motor selection happen exactly simultaneously. And this is just the source localization over visual and motor areas. So if we were to quantify that, and so that suggests that this is actually what's going on. So if we quantify that and we just plot the change of the alpha and the beta band activity, we see that they go up together. If anything, the motor preparation starts a little bit earlier. That's not really significant. And you could say, well, maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe it's just some participants are one way or some participants are another way. But you can see if you can see the gray lines, this is ubiquitous, and all the participants basically show the same thing. We also did this in a completely independent analysis fashion by just doing decoding, using the spatial maps of the topographies without resorting to alpha and beta in the brain. And we see the same pattern with both visual and motor selection happening in tandem. So this is really interesting because it shows that, whenever you can and you have motor information about things in the environment, you just don't store a visual trace and then decide what to do about it. If you have a motor affordance, it gets coded up so that it's ready to go together with the visual information. You might wonder, well, why have the visual information at all? Don't know. It's there. Maybe you could wipe it out if you had some distractor. But in this task, it would be very useful if you're doing a very fine adjustment task that you could refer back to the visual, you could bounce between the visual and the motor information to make an appropriate response. So in this task, we actually observed something even more strange, which suggests that actually the working memory system is kind of ready to go, even in ways that are completely non-adaptive and useless in a way. So actually in the same task was the first time we observed this. We also had some eye tracking recordings, as we always do, because we instruct our participants to maintain fixation and never move their eyes and do everything, because we're also recording EEG and other things. So people are maintaining fixation and doing this just with peripheral, detecting these with peripheral attention or peripheral vision, and then orienting at the time of the probe. And what we found is that when we looked at the eye traces, that people were really good. They kept their eyes at the center. But actually, if you look under the hood here and you subtract when people have to select the left item or the right item, even though they look like they look in the middle, if you subtract them all and subtract the common area, what you see, and the pink here is 0, so you see that actually when they're selecting this item, they make these tiny little microsaccades to this thing. There's nothing there. There will never be anything in the left again. But people are making these little saccades toward this mental landscape to the relevant side. And the same here with the right side. And here is just showing the time course and sort of of these items, showing that you get these very small saccades. So this is like 0.23 visual angle, or like a 4% towards the area where they have to go. And so there's lots more information in the paper. This paper is just out, I think, last week, that shows like the timings and probabilities and magnitudes and things. So this suggests that this system is kind of action ready. It's kind of also implies that we use ocular motor control systems to access and prioritize things in working memory, as maybe we do in perceptual attention. So hopefully this now makes you think. I mentioned that it's selective, sometimes adaptive and distorted. It's action ready even when as a residual leftover thing. But one of the things that that I grew up with in the field was this idea, like whatever the working memory traces are, they are not something you can muck around with. So once they're in their brain, they're already a product of selection. They're there, and they are just kind of robust and inflexible. So we get this kind of from a lot of the early papers in the 60s, like Sperling, who showed that you can orient attention to things in very brief iconic memories, but actually if you provide a post cue to sort of orient attention within working memory, that doesn't work, because you just kind of exhaustively chunk through everything in working memory until you finally bump into the thing you want. And then there's several other follow-ups and interesting studies on this, and then this, Sternberg talking about this exhaustive search mechanism. So this was kind of the dominant literature till quite recently. But there are two things that it doesn't accord with. First is our own introspection or realization that you probably think that you're able to flexibly use the contents of your working memories, like you might focus on one or another item. So we have the phenomenology that we can do that. Phenomenology is not a good guide. We have phenomenology backed up by a very good phenomenologist, so William James, like in his first original definition of attention. So William James obviously did a lot of thinking and introspection about cognitive functions. And this is the most overquoted attention definition, but it's also a very good one. He talks about it as being, everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. So even in his mind, his idea that it's not about only selecting stuff out there, it's also about selecting things in the head. So some time ago, partly through irreverence and partly through incredulity, I sort of decided to revisit this idea of whether we can't orient attention in working memory. And we actually, so this was done in 2003 with Ivan Griffin, who was then a graduate student in my lab. And we did something really, really simple. So we gave people an array of 4 colored items. And at the end, we gave them one item which was 50% likely to have been in the memory array. And they just had to say, was this item in the array? In this case, it's yes. And we gave them sometimes attentional pre-cues. So we would give an arrow pointing to the likely location of the item, which we know from the literature forever that should give people an advantage when they kind of have a foreknowledge of the relevant location versus when they don't. But we also added these, what we called retrospective or retrodictive cues, which are now called retro cues, where we presented a cue that indicated the likely relevant location of the item if it had been there. So this would have pointed you back into your memory to orient attention to this upper location. It didn't tell you whether to respond yes or no. That was still 50-50. But if the item were to be there, this would have been indicative of the item being there. And differently than all the other pre-queuing, the other post-queuing studies that Sperling and all these other people had run and failed to show any effects on, we just gave this cue a little bit of time to work. So you give a retro cue, it needs some time to do some prioritization and selection, then you present the probe, and if you do this, you get enormous benefits of orienting attention in working memory. So I'm just showing you the accuracy. This was obviously a long time ago. We have many more sophisticated methods now, but this is quite clear. So compared to when you got a neutral cue that you had no spatial cues here, your validity might have been around 72%. But if you have a pre-cue, you're much better. But if you have a retro cue, you're also much better, and actually about the same betterness. And if you get invalid cues, in each case, you're worse. So when I first presented these studies, or the first wave of these studies, I had 2 reactions. So whenever I would speak to psychologists, they really thought I was like a witch. They thought like, this is not possible. This goes against everything we've known. You're crazy. There must be some artifact. You're cheating. It was really good because people were so angry that they all actually went and tried to show that we were wrong, and we have been replicated by just about everybody in the field now. So that was eventually a nice thing. And then you had the opposite reaction from anyone who wasn't born in the cognitive neuroscience mantra, who said, well, yeah, what's so interesting about that? This is totally obvious. So you can't win any of them. So this kind of thing has been replicated by lots and lots of labs around the world. There are increasingly beautifully sophisticated paradigms and tasks to study this. And now the big question for most people is, what's the mechanism? What's the mechanism? And again, people say, oh, it's about protecting from interference. No, it's about highlighting the thing. No, it's about reducing interference from competing items. No, it's about activating the response codes and prioritizing them. So personally, I don't think any of these, even though I've contributed to lots of these findings, I don't believe that there is any one mechanism that's going to be the thing. It's just like the brain has many ways in which to prioritize and select information, and what exactly it does will partly depend on the affordances of the task, the stimuli parameters, the motor requirements, whether there are or are not distractors. So I think we're going to be looking at a multifaceted set of mechanisms through which we prioritize and select information in working memory. The other thing that people tend to think, and is a little bit more tricky, is this idea like, well, retrospective attention is just like prospective attention. It's the same thing. You just kind of flip it on its head, and you basically have the same, networks and things doing the same kind of prioritization. And to some extent, there is a lot of commonality, but it's also really important to think that there are also important differences. So, for example, in a typical prospective attention, when you're anticipating an event that's going to occur, you're anticipating some spatial location, for example, to be relevant, you have no trace to act upon. You have imagination and stuff, but you don't have the trace of the thing that you need to select. That thing is usually going to happen amidst a lot of other competing sensory information, so you have to individuate it and ward off competition. Necessarily, there will be trade-offs. If you selectively attend here, you won't be able to pick up other things. And you won't necessarily have a lot of information to help you guide response gate or to associate the trace of the relevant thing to action. But all of that is different in the retrospective cases. You have the traces, and it is true that we only maintain very few things in our working memory, about 4 in vision. So there's already a lot of that competition is gone. You just have these 4 things that are quite nicely probably individuated and orthogonalized in the brain. So maybe you don't actually have trade-offs. Maybe you have these things, they're kind of nicely packaged. You can play with one, then put it down, play with the other. So it might be quite a different type of way. And oftentimes you do have this information to prepare action and to gate action. So I'll just show you some examples where in our lab we've been showing the increasing flexibility of this system and how it kind of starts talking about some of the mechanisms that may be involved. So I'll go back to Frake and another experiment that he did. So after we initially found this finding with the eye tracking with these microsaccades, we then ran a series of additional studies to replicate and extend this. And here we've done this in this kind of retro-cueing kind of way. So we now have 4 locations. There's a delay. Then there's an informative cue, just like a retro cue in some cases, or a neutral cue in other cases. So in this case, you know that it's likely to be about this item. And then you have a delay. And then you have the probe. So here you already knew that it was going to be the pink item, so you go for the pink, and then you dial it up. Here you don't know yet, so you have to then select it and then dial it up. And when we do this, we get these typical behavioral effects. So for example, if you have an informative cue, you make less error and you're much faster than if you don't have an informative cue before. So that's a typical retro-cueing benefit. And again, if we look at these microsaccades, we see that people also orient after the spatial retro cues a little bit, make these tiny microsaccades orienting to the relevant location of the items. And if we look at the timing, if we just look at how much towards the relevant item we look, we see that after the cue, people make these microsaccades to the relevant item. If they don't have a spatial retro cue, they can only do that in the end. But interestingly, it's not like they look again once they have the probe. Once that thing is in some kind of special state, it's there in the special state. They don't have to re-look. And you say, oh, but there's this little thing here. What about that? And you say, well, actually, what we can show is that what we see here is the residual saccades of when people failed to select early on. So if we take people by performance, we see here the pink is the best performance. They saccade early on and they don't saccade again. The blue guys are the worst. I mean, these are trials, not people. In the trials, then you have much fewer microsaccades here and more at the end. So interestingly, this kind of one suggests that retro-cueing works. You get all these nice behavioral effects. You get these kind of spillover into the ocular motor system, which suggests to us that the ocular motor system is important in guiding attention within working memory, even though it's not, there is no adaptive function for us to move our eyes toward things because the stuff is gone. It's not there anymore. Although you might argue that in real life, unlike in our tasks, things remain in existence in the world. So, you might microsaccade, and then you might want to microsaccade to the same place. So our tasks artificially are decoupling something that might be more natural in behavior. So another postdoc in the lab, Nahid Zokai, who's a British Academy Research Fellow, ran a related study, but now looking at something even a little bit more crazy than the microsaccades. So this is quite cool, and we've just submitted this paper this week or last week. I'm a bit lost in time, probably over the weekend. So, and here what we showed is we showed people 2 gratings. We did two of these studies. I'm just showing you one of them. So we did two gratings, one dark and one light. And then we give people a cue, which is just an auditory cue. There's no visual stimulus whatsoever after these 2 guys. So we give them an auditory cue, and that says the left or the right one is likely to be relevant, or we give them a neutral cue. Then there's more delay, and then if they got an informative cue, they just get a probe. When they get the probe, they just have to report that one that they were cued to. So if they were cued left, they have to report the dark one. If they were cued right, they have to report the light one, and this changes from trial to trial. And then they report it, and they get some feedback. Or we give them a neutral cue, so they don't know which one they have to report, and then so here we tell them, report the one on the left or on the right. In these kinds of studies, again, like always, you have a million replications. People are faster. This is bright and dark stimuli the same. They're faster if they were cued than if they didn't get a spatial cue, and they're more precise. They make less errors. But here we measured the pupillary response. So the pupillary response is something that people have suggested might actually adapt to in anticipatory attention. So if you're anticipating something that's very bright to happen, your pupil will constrict. And if you're anticipating something very dark, your pupil will dilate to let the light in. It's pretty crazy stuff. People aren't aware of controlling their pupils as far as I know. So anyway, we recorded this, the pupil, and we see that the pupil actually adapts to what item you're attending to in your mind without there ever being any other visual stimulation going on. So here, if you're cued about so you get the cue, so the cue is auditory, there's no visual stimulus, and the probe is always the same luminance. Here, they don't know which thing to attend to because they haven't been cued yet. So everything is the same. You get an auditory cue. The auditory cue causes this big arousal pupil change. But then if you compare whether you're orienting attention or selecting a dark or a white item, you get this change in the dilation of the pupils. Whereas if you're cued to the dark thing, your pupil is bigger. And if you're cued to the bright thing, your pupil is constricted. So this suggests that these kind of retro-cueing functions, they affect all the way to your pupillary response, and that also suggests that somehow this whole process of orienting attention in working memory is able to tap into sensory information and even to affect the most peripheral kinds of sensory aspects of the representation. Again, in this task, we've decoupled past from future so that there is no, light and dark thing here on purpose so that we could show this, but in real life it may be, again, that when you're orienting to something in mind is because you expect to interact with it again in the future. So those things are indicative of some of the mechanisms. We've also looked at some of the mechanisms in the brain. To some extent, this is like really early work where we compared pre-cueing and retro-cueing in the brain. And we saw that if you know anything about normal visual spatial attention, we know that this dorsal frontoparietal network, which is very related to the ocular motor control network, is involved in spatial shifts of attention. It's also involved in these spatial retro shifts of attention. But in addition, you get these additional areas when you're cueing to things back in memory, which involve some inferior prefrontal areas, some medial prefrontal areas, some ventral prefrontal areas, which we believe are also related to the selection and action gating nowadays. But obviously, there's a whole bunch of other MR studies. I've put some of them there. I'm not going to go into them. But I'll just show you some of like what our electrophysiology kind of gives us a more dynamic picture of this. So this was done with George Wallace, who was a PhD student between myself and Mark Stokes in the lab. And basically we did the same task again, but with MEG, to look at this kind of process of orienting in attention and in working memory. We get the usual really big benefits of pre-cues and retro-cues. This is accuracy. They improve the accuracy about the same extent compared to the neutral cues. They speed up. This is a histogram of response times. There's two blue lines here showing that people are really much faster with either a pre-cue or retro-cue compared to the black neutral. And what people had expected to see at that time is like once you orient attention in working memory is that you kind of go into this state of attention and you're just like now in this kind of rumbling state of attention. And what we actually saw wasn't that at all. What we saw is that we got the same alpha change over the brain, but it was very short-lived. So you have this alpha contralateral desynchronization, just lateralizes and disappears. So it's as if these cues kind of access the visual information, put them in some other state, and they were done. You know, it's like you change something, done, and then it's very dynamic. So if you look at a pre-cue, this is the alpha effect in the pre-cue, it is the case that you get a cue, and then you get alpha, and it just stays there until the array happens. So it's anticipating, it builds up until the array happens. And if you do some sort of looking at sort of the dynamics of this process, you see that once these cueing things happen, you're kind of in the same state for a long period of time. So this is cross-temporal generalization plot. But if you have a retro-cue, the retro-cue again changes the alpha, but it goes up and down, back, just lasts a short while, and it's a much, much more dynamic process. We replicated this in old people. Again, there was a study showing old people can't do anything. They can't orient attention and working memory and stuff. Our old people can do everything. So they're really good with the retro cues. They get much sharper in their responses and are able to sort of judge the orientation of the relevant things. They make less errors. And we also recorded their brain activity. And again, we find this pattern of very short-lived alpha desynchronization contralaterally. In older people, we also see some spillover into the beta band. We don't know why that is. And this is a very large group of participants that we have, so we were able to use the individual variability in these people to look at what correlates with good performance and benefits of orienting attention in the brain. And we see that the shorter this effect, the better the people are. So it's a very dynamic thing, and actually people who are able to snap in and out of this selection process, they're actually better than people who sort of linger in this kind of alpha lateralization state. I can see now that my husband was right that I should have removed the 30 slides, which I did remove. I have a few more to go, but we're kind of about 3/4 of the way through. Okay, so I've now hopefully convinced you that orienting, you can orient attention in working memory. It's a dynamic process. But the last couple of studies just show that this is a process that's very different from the perceptual attention in that it's reversible and highly, highly flexible. And this is another set of studies by Frake and by Nahid. So in this study, it's very similar to, as you can recognize, the Frake studies. We have two oriented bars. And at some point, people know that they're going to be probed. They know which one they have to report because there's a color that matches one of these. Again, these shift sides randomly. And the trick here is that they learn that if they're probed early about this, it means that they're going to be likely to be probed about the yellowy one. If nothing happens, and time just passes, there's nothing on the screen, it's just time passing, and they're probed late, then they're most likely to be probed about the other one, the blue one. So everybody knows like early yellow, late blue, or I'm like early blue, late yellow, everyone's different. These things happen all the time, and we can use this alpha desynchronization to look at what happens. And anyway, once they're ready, they have an unlimited time. They say, yeah, I got it, make a decision, press a button, and then they're on the clock, and they have to do this as quickly as possible to match it to that orientation. So most theories of working memory would say, like, once you've prioritized this thing and you've selected one, that's it. You've lost the other one. That's the only thing you've had. You've thrown everything else away. But as I said, maybe this is a different context in which you have a few things and you can play around with them and bring them up and down as you wish. And actually, that's what we find. It's astonishing. The behavioral results are, I think, really beautiful. So this is response times, or the decision times, and this is the accuracy. They both show the same thing. So they basically show that you're faster and you make fewer errors if you're probed about the one you're anticipating early on. But your other one, which is now really bad, like you're really slow and make a lot of error if you're probed about that other one, but that's now not gone. You haven't like just thrown it out forever, because now, just with time passages, that guy, which was really lousy, is now really fast and really accurate, and the other one becomes really slow and really inaccurate. So this suggests a really different, playful kind of, can't think of the word, sort of space where you can play around with these different things, very, very different than orienting to perceptual items. And this is to show that we also recorded the brain activity here, and we showed this alpha desynchronization, and we could show that the alpha desynchronization just before the time that the item was being probed correlates with people's performance on a trial-by-trial basis. And that happens for early or late items. Anyway, so we can skip this. And very recently, again to our astonishment, Nahid replicated the same kind of idea with this pupil response. So she basically did the same thing that Frake did. So people just have one dark and one light thing. They learn that if they're probed early, they're likely to be probed to the left, for example. And then if nothing happens and time passes and they're probed late, they're likely to be probed about the item on the right. And then they report it and they get some feedback. And here they're orienting to the left or the right. And of course, these items actually have this brightness associated with them. So first of all, we replicate the same pattern of behavioral results. This is just orient left or right with passage of time. Again, people show this crossover. This is showing the accuracy or precision. Precision is now positive. So this is people are really precise at the item they're anticipating compared to the item they're not anticipating. And here's the pupil response, showing this modulation of the pupil response, that if you're anticipating something dark early on, you open your pupils. Here there's no big bang of the sound, so you don't have that big upgoing response. But then as time passes, it reverses. So that, and here we just plotted it, if you're anticipating black again, your pupil dilates again. So it's pretty crazy that even your pupil responses are dynamically changing according to which items are going in and out of the focus of your working memory. So hopefully now you have slightly more sort of flexible, prospective, reversible concept of how we can orient in memories. And I've been telling you basically about working memory, and you think, yeah, okay, but what about real memory? So luckily for you, real memory is really hard to study in this way, so we've done almost nothing on this. I've started thinking about, like, well, most likely we do store in mind the things that are going to be relevant for our actions in the future, how the brain knows that, how does it do that at the various time scales. Fascinating, almost a philosophical question, really difficult to study. We know that actually we remember things that we attended to more than things that we didn't attend to, and actually Shlomo Benton in the 80s actually showed some of that really beautiful work also with ERPs at the time. So we know that we don't just put everything in the same into our long-term memories, and we will store those things that are likely to be relevant to us. But can we also selectively focus on different aspects on our long-term memory? And again, our intuition would say, yeah, that's kind of what we do all the time. When we fail a lot, we fail at retrieving things, but when we're successful at retrieving things, they are an act of prioritization and selection of relevant things from within our long-term memories. But how to study that? We don't really have a really good experimental setup to do that. So we're just starting, and this is totally unfinished stuff, but just to show you that this is something that we're playing around with. And this is work being done by my graduate student, Nora Roast. And so basically we're teaching people new spatial contextual memories, and then we're going to try to see if we can orient attention to certain aspects of their memories. So the first part of the teaching thing is people see these objects that are very obvious, like superimposed on top of these scenes. So we expose them for a while, take them away, and they would say, which one was there? And they'll say, okay, the strawberry, okay, put it in its place. They put it in its place. Which other one was there? A Rubik's Cube, put it in its place. And so people learn this. They do this over 3 blocks. They're learning 100, in some cases 200 of these scenes. They learn. They get faster and faster. They get more and more precise at placing this thing. So this is just a learning thing. And then we send them away, and then we see whether we can use these memories. Now, for us, it's easy because we've just done 1, but if people have done 100 or 200 of these, it's quite hard. So we've done 2 studies. This is the first one. We're on our 3rd now to replicate it. This is the slow one, and then we've done a fast-paced one. This is the cautious entry here. So we give people now just a scene, and then we just very quickly flash a spatial cue, saying we're likely to ask you about the one on the left, or we're likely to ask you about the one on the right, or we give them a neutral cue, and then these things just show up and they have to retrieve one of them. So the question is, can people orient attention within long-term memory to optimize their retrieval here? And of course the answer is yes, or else I wouldn't be telling you this. So people, in this case, are very accurate in both cases, whether they have valid cues or neutral cues, but they're much faster at accessing the thing if they've already kind of oriented their attention to that spatial location in long-term memory. So this is our first cautious attempt. Now we've moved this at a much faster pace to see how quickly we can push this, and it's still working the faster we push it, but it's still, this is baby steps till we get there. So that is the marathon of studies. So hopefully you're beginning to sort of think of these memories not just being sitting there as just useless traces that just hang around, but as these functional states that serve the future, that they themselves are very selective and formative and action-ready and prospective, but they're also, we can act upon them with attention to add much more flexibility, and they can do that in these very dynamic and reversible ways. So that's all I had to tell you today, so thank you very much.